Hello everyone, welcome to the channel that brings you the best and most authentic accounts of attacks and sightings of the legendary Bigfoot. Before we begin today's story, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It's very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. Click the like button, all because.
The winding road stretched before us, cutting through the dense forests of the Ozark Mountains like a serpent. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white with tension. Something about this trip felt off, a nagging sensation in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't shake. "Hey David, you okay over there? You look like you've seen a ghost." Paul chuckled from the passenger seat, his easygoing nature a stark contrast to my growing unease. I forced a smile, trying to push down the anxiety bubbling up inside me. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bit tired from the drive, I guess." Paul shrugged, turning his attention back to the map spread across his lap. "Well, we're almost there. Should be another 15 minutes or so until we reach the trailhead." I nodded, focusing on the road ahead. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers over the asphalt. As we rounded another bend, a deer darted across the road, causing me to slam on the brakes. "Whoa!" Paul exclaimed, bracing himself against the dashboard. "That was close." My heart raced as I watched the deer disappear into the underbrush. "Yeah, too close," I muttered, a chill running down my spine. We finally arrived at the small parking area marking the start of our planned hiking route. As we got out of the car and began unloading our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Did you hear that?" I asked, pausing as I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders. Paul looked up from adjusting his bootlaces. "Hear what?" "I don't know. It sounded like rustling in the bushes over there." I gestured towards a thick patch of vegetation at the edge of the clearing. Paul stood up, squinting in the direction I had pointed. After a moment, he shook his head. "I don't hear anything, man. Probably just the wind or a squirrel or something. You're really on edge today, aren't you?" I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. "Sorry, I don't know what's gotten into me. Let's just get going." We set off down the trail, the dense canopy overhead casting dappled shadows across our path. As we hiked, Paul chatted animatedly about his latest rock-climbing adventure, his voice echoing through the trees. I tried to focus on his story, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his laughter was too loud, too attention-grabbing in this quiet forest. "Hey, Paul," I interrupted. "Maybe we should keep it down a bit, not disturb the wildlife or anything." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Disturb the wildlife? David, we're in the middle of nowhere. The only thing we're likely to see out here are squirrels and maybe a deer or two if we're lucky." I nodded, feeling foolish. "You're right. I don't know why I'm so jumpy today." As the day wore on, we covered several miles of challenging terrain. The forest grew denser, the trail narrower. By late afternoon, we decided to make camp in a small clearing near a bubbling stream. "This looks like a good spot," Paul said, dropping his pack with a satisfied grunt. "I'll gather some firewood if you want to set up the tent." I agreed, grateful for the distraction of a task. As I worked on pitching the tent, I tried to shake off the persistent feeling of unease. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the only sound the rustling of the tent material as I secured it to the ground. Paul returned with an armload of wood, and soon we had a cheerful fire crackling in the center of our campsite. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, we sat around the fire, cooking a simple meal of dehydrated camping food. "See? This isn't so bad, is it?" Paul said, gesturing around with his fork. "Fresh air, beautiful scenery, no cell phones or emails to bother us. This is the life." I managed a small smile. "Yeah, I guess you're right, it is pretty peaceful out here." But as I gazed into the fire, the flickering flames seemed to cast menacing shadows at the edge of our campsite. Shapes that looked almost like a large, lumbering figure moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Did you see that?" I asked, suddenly alert. Paul looked up from his meal, frowning. "See what?" I pointed towards the tree line. "I thought I saw something move over there." Paul turned, squinting into the darkness. After a long moment, he shook his head. I don't see anything, David. Are you sure you're not just seeing things? The shadows can play tricks on your eyes out here. I rubbed my eyes, suddenly feeling very tired. Yeah, you're probably right. Maybe I'm just overtired from the hike. As the night wore on, Paul's laughter echoed through the trees as he recounted funny stories from our college days. But each time his voice rose, I found myself glancing nervously at the surrounding forest, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at us. Finally, as the fire began to die down, Paul stood up with a stretch. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm beat. Ready to turn in? I nodded, relief washing over me at the thought of being safely zipped up in our tent. As we doused the fire and prepared for bed, I couldn't help but feel that the darkness was pressing in around us, alive and watchful. Inside the tent, Paul quickly drifted off to sleep, his soft snores filling the small space. I lay awake, staring at the nylon ceiling, every small sound from the forest outside setting my nerves on edge. Just as I was finally starting to relax, a twig snapped loudly just outside our tent. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding in my chest. Paul, I whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. Paul, wake up. What is it? He mumbled groggily. I heard something outside the tent, I hissed. Paul sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. What kind of something? I don't know. It sounded big. We sat in tense silence for several long moments, straining our ears. The forest outside was deathly quiet. Just as Paul opened his mouth to speak, likely to tell me I was imagining things again, another snap echoed through the clearing, closer this time. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, like that of a large animal. Paul's eyes widened in the dim light of our small lantern. Okay, I heard that, he whispered. My hand shook as I reached for the zipper of the tent. We need to see what it is. Paul grabbed my wrist. Are you crazy? If it's a bear or something, we're safer in here. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what was out there was far worse than any bear. With trembling fingers, I slowly unzipped the tent flap, peering out into the oppressive darkness of the forest. At first, I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of our campsite, a massive dark shape moved. It was far too large to be a bear, its outline vaguely humanoid but distorted, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I caught a glimpse of matted fur and the glint of teeth in a misshaped jaw. Then, with horrifying speed, the creature turned and looked directly at me, its eyes reflecting the faint light from our tent, like twin points of hellfire. I let out a strangled gasp, my body frozen in terror. In that moment, I knew with sickening certainty that our hiking trip had just become a nightmare from which we might never wake. The first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow over our campsite. I blinked awake, my mind foggy with the remnants of unsettling dreams. As consciousness fully returned, so did the memory of the terrifying shape I'd glimpsed in the darkness. I sat up abruptly, my heart racing. Paul, I whispered urgently, shaking my friend's shoulder. Paul, wake up. He groaned, rolling over in his sleeping bag. What time is it? Early, I replied, already unzipping the tent. But we need to check something. Paul mumbled incoherently, but followed me out of the tent. The morning air was crisp, a light mist hanging over the clearing. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Then I saw it. Oh my God, I breathed, taking in the scene before us. Our campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado. The remnants of our food supplies were strewn across the ground, packaging torn to shreds. Our backpacks, which we'd left outside the tent, were upended, their contents scattered. Paul's eyes widened as he surveyed the damage. What the hell happened? I swallowed hard, remembering the massive shape from the night before. I don't know, but look at this. I pointed to a nearby tree where deep gouges marred the bark, as if something with enormous claws had used it as a scratching post. Paul ran his hand over the marks, his face pale. These are fresh, and way too high up to be from a bear. We spent the next hour salvaging what we could of our supplies. Most of our food was gone or ruined, leaving us with only a few energy bars and some trail mix. Our water bottles were intact, thankfully, but one of Paul's hiking boots was missing. "We should head back," I said, stuffing the last of our usable gear into my backpack. "We don't have enough supplies to continue, and whatever did this..." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Paul nodded, his usual cheerful demeanor subdued. "Yeah, you're right. Let's pack up and get out of here." As we struck camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed different in the light of day, the trees looming ominously, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. We set off down the trail, our pace quicker than the day before. The woods were unnaturally quiet, no birdsong or rustle of small animals. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Do you hear that?" I asked after we'd been walking for about an hour. Paul stopped, cocking his head to listen. "Hear what?" "It's like whispers, coming from the trees." He looked at me skeptically. "David, there's no one else out here. It's probably just the wind." But there was no wind, not even a breeze. As we continued hiking, the whispers seemed to grow louder, unintelligible but urgent. I tried to ignore them, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Suddenly, Paul grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said, his voice tight. "Do you smell that?" I inhaled deeply and immediately regretted it. A foul stench permeated the air, unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It was a mixture of rotting meat, wet fur, and something else, something primordial and terrifying. "What is that?" I gagged, covering my nose with my shirt. Paul shook his head, his face green. "I don't know, but it's getting stronger." We quickened our pace, desperate to escape the nauseating odor. The trail narrowed, forcing us to walk single file. The trees pressed in closer, their branches seeming to reach for us as we passed. "Paul," I called out, my voice shaky. "I think we should turn back. Find another way out." He turned to face me, about to respond, when his eyes widened in shock. "David, look!" I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, in a patch of mud just off the trail, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This was massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with distinct toe impressions and a depth that suggested incredible weight. That's not possible," Paul whispered, crouching down to examine the print more closely. I scanned the surrounding area and spotted more prints leading off into the dense underbrush. "There's more. Whatever made these, it's big. Really big." Paul stood up, his face pale. "We need to get out of here. Now." We abandoned all pretense of calm, breaking into a jog. The whispers from the trees seemed to grow more insistent, the foul odor intensifying with each step. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran, the trail becoming increasingly overgrown. As the day wore on, the sky darkened prematurely. Thick clouds rolled in, obscuring the sun and plunging the forest into an eerie twilight. We were forced to slow our pace, picking our way carefully over roots and rocks. "We should have reached the trailhead by now," Paul panted, checking his watch. "It's like we're going in circles." I was about to agree when a sound stopped me in my tracks. It started low, barely audible, then grew in volume and intensity until it filled the entire forest. An inhuman howl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a sound of rage, of hunger, of primeval fury. Paul's face drained of all color. What was that?" I couldn't answer. My entire body was frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything to escape whatever had made that terrifying noise. The howl faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it was deafening. Then in the distance we heard the crack of breaking branches. Something large was moving through the forest, heading in our direction. "Run," I whispered, my voice hoarse with fear. "Run." We took off, all thoughts of following the trail abandoned. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Behind us, the sound of pursuit grew louder, punctuated by more of those blood-curdling howls. "There!" Paul shouted, pointing ahead. "I see a cave." Through the gloom, I could make out the dark mouth of a cave set into a rocky hillside. Without hesitation, we made for it, desperation lending speed to our tired legs. We burst into the cave, its cool darkness enveloping us. We pressed ourselves against the back wall, trying to quiet our ragged breathing. Outside, something large moved past the cave entrance. We caught a glimpse of matted fur, of a massive, lumbering shape that seemed to defy description. The foul odor we'd encountered earlier filled the cave, so strong it made my eyes water. For what felt like hours, we huddled in that cave, hardly daring to breathe. Eventually, the sounds of movement outside faded, but neither of us was eager to venture out. "What do we do now?" Paul whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, trying to think through the fog of terror. We wait until daylight. Then we make a run for it." As night fell in earnest, the forest outside came alive with strange sounds. Howls and growls echoed through the trees, interspersed with the crack of breaking wood and the thud of heavy footsteps. In the darkness of the cave, Paul and I clung to each other, our earlier skepticism shattered by the horrors we'd witnessed. Whatever was out there, it defied explanation. It was something ancient, something that should not exist in our modern world. As I listened to the nightmarish cacophony outside, one thought kept repeating in my mind: would we survive to see the dawn? And if we did, what new terrors would the light of day reveal? The night stretched on, each moment an eternity of fear and anticipation. We were trapped, with no way of knowing if our hidden sanctuary would remain undiscovered until morning. All we could do was wait and hope and pray that whatever stalked the forests of the Ozarks would not find us before we could make our escape. The first light of dawn crept into the cave, revealing our haggard faces. Neither Paul nor I had slept, our bodies tense and alert throughout the long, terrifying night. As the forest outside gradually lightened, the otherworldly sounds that had haunted us faded away. "Do you think it's safe?" Paul whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. I peered out of the cave entrance, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I don't see anything. Maybe it's gone. We cautiously emerged from our sanctuary, muscles stiff from the cramped conditions. The forest seemed almost normal in the early morning light, birds chirping and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. But the peace was deceptive, the memory of last night's horrors still fresh in our minds. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to orient myself. "The trail has to be nearby." Paul nodded, his eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. "Yeah, let's go. I don't want to spend another minute in this god-forsaken forest." We set off in what we hoped was the direction of the trail, our pace quick despite our exhaustion. The terror of the night had given way to a grim determination to survive, to escape whatever nightmarish creature stalked these woods. After about an hour of trekking, we stumbled upon a small clearing. Relief washed over me as I recognized it as our original campsite. "Look," I said, pointing to our tent still standing where we'd left it. "We can grab our stuff and then head straight for the trail. It shouldn't be far now." Paul nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Thank God. Let's make it quick, though. I've got a bad feeling." We hurried into the clearing, quickly gathering what remained of our scattered supplies. As I was shoving a spare shirt into my backpack, a sound like rolling thunder filled the air. I looked up, confused. The sky was clear, no sign of a storm. Then I saw it. A massive boulder, easily the size of a car, came hurtling through the air towards us. Time seemed to slow as I watched its trajectory, realizing with horror that it was aimed directly at our campsite. "Paul, look out!" I screamed, diving to the side. The boulder crashed into our camp with a deafening impact, missing us by mere inches. Our tent was obliterated, gear sent flying in all directions. As the dust settled, an eerie silence fell over the forest. Paul and I locked eyes, both of us too shocked to speak. Then, from the direction the boulder had come, we heard it. Heavy footsteps, branches snapping under enormous weight. Slowly, we turned towards the sound. At the edge of the clearing, a massive, hair-covered silhouette emerged from the shadows. It was the creature we'd glimpsed the night before, but in the light of day, its true horror was fully revealed. The beast stood at least 9 feet tall, its body covered in matted, dark fur. Its arms were impossibly long, ending in hands tipped with curved claws. But it was the face that froze the blood in my veins. A twisted parody of a human visage, with a protruding jaw filled with yellowed fangs and eyes that gleamed with malevolent intelligence. For a moment, nobody moved. The creature surveyed us with predatory intent, its nostrils flaring as it caught our scent. Then, with a speed that defied its massive size, it charged. Paul's scream pierced the air, snapping me out of my paralysis. "Run!" I yelled, already turning to flee, but Paul hesitated a split second too long. A hairy arm, thick as a tree trunk, shot out and wrapped around his torso. Paul's scream was cut short as the breath was squeezed from his lungs. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I knew I was looking at death itself. "David, help me!" Paul managed to gasp out, struggling weakly against the monster's grip. I wanted to help. God knows I did, but terror had me rooted to the spot. I watched in horror as the creature lifted Paul off the ground, bringing him closer to its nightmarish face. The sound of snapping bones filled the air, and Paul's struggles ceased abruptly. A primal scream tore from my throat as I watched my friend go limp in the monster's grasp. That scream seemed to break whatever spell had held me in place. Survival instinct took over, and I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature's roar of fury and the sound of its pursuit. I ran blindly, no thought in my mind except to get away, to survive. The forest blurred around me, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see gaining on me. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. I had run right off the edge of a steep embankment. I tumbled down the slope, my body bouncing off rocks and roots. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, every inch of me ached, but the pain was distant, secondary to the all-consuming terror. I lay there dazed and winded, listening intently for any sign of pursuit. The forest had gone quiet again, no sound of the creature's approach. Had I lost it? Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. My clothes were torn and bloody, and I was pretty sure I had at least one broken rib. But I was alive. More than I could say for poor Paul. The thought of my friend sent a fresh wave of grief and guilt washing over me. I had left him to die, had run away instead of trying to help. But what could I have done against that monster? As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full horror of what had just happened hit me. I collapsed to my knees, retching into the leaf litter. Tears streamed down my face as I sobbed, the sound echoing through the empty forest. I don't know how long I knelt there, lost in my grief and terror. When I finally looked up, the sun had moved significantly in the sky. I had to move. The creature could still be out there, hunting me. With a groan of pain, I forced myself to stand. I had no idea where I was, no supplies, no weapon. All I knew was that I had to get out of this forest, had to find help, had to tell someone about what had happened here. As I stumbled through the woods trying to find any sign of civilization, my mind kept replaying the attack. The impossible strength of the creature, the look of terror on Paul's face, the sickening sound of bones breaking. It was like something out of a nightmare, but the pain in my body and the blood on my clothes were all too real. Night was falling by the time I finally stumbled out of the forest and onto a rural road. A passing car screeched to a halt, its driver looking at me with shock and concern. "Are you all right?" the woman asked, rolling down her window. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but how could I? How could I possibly make anyone believe what I had seen, what I had experienced? Please, I managed to croak out, my voice raw from hours of silence. I need help, my friend, he's still out there. The woman's eyes widened, and she quickly unlocked her car doors. Get in. I'll take you to the hospital. As we drove away from the forest, I couldn't help but look back. In the gathering darkness, I could have sworn I saw a large, shadowy figure watching from among the trees. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned away, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew. The nightmare wasn't over. The creature was still out there, waiting in the dark heart of the forest, and I was the only one who knew the truth about what lurked in the shadows of the Ozarks. The forest had become a blur of green and brown as I tore through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. The image of Paul's lifeless body in the creature's grasp was seared into my mind, driving me forward despite the burning in my legs and the sharp pain in my side. Branches whipped across my face, leaving stinging welts, but I couldn't slow down. I couldn't stop. Because behind me, growing ever closer, I could hear it. The heavy breathing, like a freight train bearing down on me. The thunderous footsteps that shook the very earth beneath my feet. Oh God, I panted, my voice a ragged whisper. Please, somebody help me. But there was no one to hear my desperate pleas. No one except the monster that pursued me with relentless determination. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of matted fur and flashing teeth. The creature was gaining on me, its long arms reaching out, claws extended. A scream tore from my throat as I pushed myself harder, ignoring the protest of my burning muscles. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond the primal need to escape. The forest seemed to grow denser, the trees pressing in closer as if trying to impede my flight. Roots reached up to tangle my feet, and low-hanging branches clawed at my face and arms. It was as if the entire forest had come alive, working in concert with the beast to bring me down. This can't be happening, I gasped, ducking under a fallen log. This can't be real. But the hot breath on the back of my neck was all too real. The creature was so close now I could smell its foul odor, a mixture of wet fur and rotting meat that made my stomach churn. Panic overwhelmed me as I realized I was hopelessly lost. The trees all looked the same, an endless maze of green and brown. I had no idea which direction led to safety, or if there was any safety to be found in this nightmare forest. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet changed. I was no longer running on soft forest loam, but hard-packed dirt, a trail. Without thinking, I veered onto it, hoping against hope that it might lead me to civilization, to help. For a brief moment, I felt a surge of hope. The trail was easier to navigate, allowing me to pick up speed. But then I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The creature had realized my plan, and it was not happy. With a roar that shook the leaves from the trees, it burst onto the trail behind me. I could feel the vibrations of its footfalls through the soles of my shoes, each impact drawing closer. No, I moaned, pushing myself beyond what I thought possible. My lungs were on fire, each breath a struggle. The trail curved sharply to the right, and as I rounded the bend, my foot caught on an exposed root. I stumbled, my arms windmilling as I fought to keep my balance. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought I would fall. That moment of hesitation was all the creature needed. A massive hand swiped at me, its claws raking across my back. The force of the blow sent me flying off the trail, tumbling head over heels down a steep embankment I hadn't even seen. The world spun around me as I rolled, bouncing off rocks and crashing through underbrush. Pain exploded through my body with each impact. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom of the slope, I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. Every part of me hurt. I could feel warm blood trickling down my back where the creature's claws had torn through my shirt and skin. But the pain was secondary to the overwhelming terror that gripped me. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and my ragged breathing. Then, from somewhere up the slope, came the sound of snapping branches and a low, guttural growl. It was still coming. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I crawled on my hands and knees, dragging myself through the mud towards a fallen tree I could see nearby. It wasn't much, but it was the only cover available. I squeezed myself into the small space beneath the rotting log, trying to make myself as small as possible. The rough bark scraped against my wounds, sending fresh waves of pain through my body, but I bit my lip to keep from crying out. Lying there in the mud, I prayed fervently that the monster wouldn't find me. I tried to control my breathing, to be as silent as possible, but it felt like my heartbeat alone was loud enough to give me away. The sounds of the creature's approach grew louder. I could hear it sniffing the air, letting out occasional growls of frustration. It was searching for me. Tears streamed down my face as I pressed myself further into the mud. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please don't find me." The footsteps drew nearer. Through a small gap in the log, I could see its massive, fur-covered feet. They were easily twice the size of my own, with long, curved claws that dug into the soft earth. The creature paused so close that I could have reached out and touched it. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle. For what felt like an eternity, it stood there, turning slowly as if scanning the area. Then, with a snort of frustration, it moved away. I listened as its footsteps faded into the distance, hardly daring to believe that it had given up. Even after I could no longer hear it, I remained frozen in my hiding place. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Was it truly gone, or was this just a trick? Was it waiting for me to reveal myself? As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. Every inch of my body ached, and the claw marks on my back burned like fire. I was covered in mud and blood, my clothes torn to shreds. Slowly, cautiously, I began to extract myself from beneath the log. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through my battered body, but I gritted my teeth and pressed on. I couldn't stay here forever. Once free, I leaned against the log, trying to get my bearings. The slope I had tumbled down loomed before me, a near vertical wall of earth and roots. There was no way I could climb back up, not in my current condition. "Think, David," I muttered to myself, running a shaking hand through my mud-caked hair. "You have to find a way out of here." But as I looked around at the unfamiliar forest, a wave of despair washed over me. I was lost, injured, and being hunted by a monster that shouldn't exist. How could I possibly hope to survive? The sound of running water caught my attention. A stream, perhaps? Where there was water, there might be a way out of this green hell. With a groan of pain, I pushed myself to my feet. My legs trembled, threatening to give out, but I forced myself to take one step, then another. I had to keep moving, had to find help, had to warn someone about the creature that lurked in these woods. As I stumbled through the forest, following the sound of water, my mind raced. What was that thing? How could something like that exist without anyone knowing? And what would happen if I did manage to escape to tell my story? Would anyone believe me? The memory of Paul's final moments flashed through my mind, bringing a fresh wave of grief and guilt. I had left him behind, had run instead of trying to help. But what could I have done against a monster like that? "I'm sorry, Paul," I whispered, tears mixing with the mud on my face. "I'm so sorry." As night began to fall, casting long shadows through the trees, I finally reached the stream. It was little more than a trickle of water over rocks, but it was flowing downhill, and downhill, I hoped, would eventually lead to civilization. With no other options, I began to follow the stream, my feet slipping on the wet rocks. Each step was agony, but the alternative, giving up, lying down to die in this godforsaken forest, was unthinkable. As darkness settled over the forest, strange sounds began to echo through the trees. Howls and growls that sent shivers down my spine. Was it the creature still hunting me? Or were there more of them out there? I pressed on, driven by fear and desperation. Somewhere out there was safety, help, a chance to warn others about the horror that lurked in these woods. I just had to reach it. And so I stumbled onward through the night, battered, bleeding, but not broken. The chase might have ended for now, but I knew deep in my bones that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The creature was still out there waiting, and I was the only one who knew the truth. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by my surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and with them, a wave of pain that made me gasp. I had collapsed sometime during the night, my battered body finally giving out. Now, as I tried to move, every muscle screamed in protest. Gritting my teeth, I forced myself into a sitting position and took stock of my injuries. My clothes were torn and caked with mud and dried blood. Angry red welts crisscrossed my arms and face where branches had whipped me during my frantic flight. But it was my left shoulder that concerned me most. It hung at an odd angle, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from it. "Dislocated," I muttered, wincing as I prodded it gently. "Just perfect." I knew I needed to set it back in place, but the thought made my stomach churn. Still, it had to be done. I couldn't hope to make it out of this forest with a useless arm. Taking a deep breath, I braced myself against a nearby tree trunk. "Okay, David," I said aloud, trying to psych myself up. "On 3, 1, 2. I jerked my body hard, feeling a sickening pop as the joint slid back into place. A scream tore from my throat, echoing through the quiet forest. For a moment, the world swam before my eyes, and I thought I might pass out. As the pain subsided to a dull throb, I became aware of just how quiet the forest had become. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered why I had been running in the first place. The creature. Was it still out there hunting me? I struggled to my feet, every movement and exercise in agony. I had to keep moving, had to find my way back to civilization, to warn someone about what lurked in these woods. As I stumbled forward, using trees for support, I tried to orient myself. The stream I had been following the night before burbled nearby. Downhill, I reminded myself. Follow the water downhill. Every shadow made me flinch, every rustle of leaves had me whirling around in panic. My heart raced, adrenaline flooding my system despite my exhaustion. I kept expecting to see that massive fur-covered form lunging at me from behind a tree. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, forcing my breathing to slow. "You can't panic now. You have to make it out of here." The thought of Paul flashed through my mind, bringing a fresh wave of guilt and grief. I had left him behind, had run while that thing tore him apart. What kind of friend was I? "I'm sorry, Paul," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I'm so sorry, but I promise, I'll make sure everyone knows what happened. Your death won't be for nothing." As the day wore on, the forest remained unnaturally silent. The only sounds were the babbling of the stream and my own labored breathing. The quiet was oppressive, adding to the surreal nature of my situation. It was mid-afternoon when I finally heard something that made my heart leap. The distant sound of a car engine. Civilization. I was close. With renewed energy, I pushed myself harder, ignoring the protests of my battered body. The trees began to thin, and suddenly, I burst out onto a narrow dirt road. For a moment, I just stood there, swaying slightly, hardly daring to believe it. Then in the distance I saw a wooden structure, a ranger station. I stumbled towards it, relief washing over me in waves. As I approached, the door opened, and a man in a park ranger uniform stepped out, his eyes widening as he took in my appearance. "Jesus Christ," he exclaimed, rushing towards me. "What happened to you, son?" I opened my mouth to explain, but suddenly found I couldn't speak. How could I possibly describe what I had been through? Who would believe me? We were attacked, I managed to croak out. My friend, he's dead. There's something out there. Something not natural. The ranger's face creased with concern. He gently took my arm, leading me towards the station. Come on inside. We'll get you patched up and call for help. Inside the station, another ranger, a woman, gasped when she saw me. Oh my God, Mark. What happened? Not sure yet, Sarah. The male ranger, Mark, replied. Get on the radio. We need medical evac and the sheriff's department out here ASAP. As Sarah made the calls, Mark sat me down and began cleaning my visible wounds. Can you tell me what happened? He asked gently. Where's your friend? I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. We were camping, I began, my voice shaky. 2 nights ago, something attacked our campsite. We ran, hid in a cave. Yesterday morning, we thought it was safe, but I trailed off, the words sticking in my throat. How could I describe the horror of what I had seen? Mark nodded encouragingly. Take your time, son. What happened next? It came back, I whispered, my eyes unfocused as I relived the terrifying moment. This creature, huge, covered in fur, it grabbed Paul. I heard his bones snap, and then it came after me. I looked up, seeing the skepticism in Mark's eyes. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. It sounded insane, even to my own ears. Look, I said, a note of desperation creeping into my voice. I know how this sounds, but I swear to you it's the truth. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist. Mark exchanged a glance with Sarah, who had finished making the calls and was now listening to my story. Their skeptical looks told me everything I needed to know. They thought I was crazy or lying or both. It's all right, Mark said soothingly, in a tone one might use with a frightened child. You're safe now. We'll figure out what happened. But I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe a word I was saying. And why should they? A giant, man-eating monster in the woods? It was the stuff of campfire stories, not reality. As we waited for help to arrive, I sank into a numb silence. How could I make them understand? How could I convince them of the danger lurking in the forest? The sound of approaching sirens broke through my thoughts. Moments later, paramedics burst through the door, followed closely by 2 sheriff's deputies. As the paramedics began examining me, one of the deputies approached. I'm Deputy Hanson, he introduced himself. Can you tell me what happened out there? I looked up at him, seeing the same skepticism in his eyes that I had seen in the Rangers. For a moment I considered telling him everything, about the creature, about Paul's terrible fate. But what was the point? They'd write me off as a madman, and any chance of finding Paul or stopping that thing would be lost. So instead, I shook my head. We were attacked, I said quietly. An animal, I think. Big. It got Paul. I ran. I don't remember much else. Deputy Hanson nodded, jotting notes in a small pad. And where exactly were you camping? I described the location as best I could, watching as he relayed the information to his partner. They would go out there, I knew. They would search for Paul, for any sign of what had happened. But they wouldn't find anything. That creature, whatever it was, would be long gone. As the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance, I caught one last glimpse of the forest through the open door. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement among the trees, a large, dark shape watching from the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. A trick of the light, I told myself, or my traumatized mind playing tricks on me. It had to be. But as the ambulance doors closed and we pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That creature was still out there waiting, and I was the only one who knew the truth. As we sped towards the hospital, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to prove what had happened. I would make them believe me no matter what it took, because if I didn't, how many more people would fall victim to the monster in the woods? The forest fell away behind us, but the memory of those terrifying nights remained. And somewhere in the depths of those ancient trees, something waited. Something hungry. Something that shouldn't exist but did. And I was the only one who could stop it. The hospital released me after 2 days of tests and observations. My physical injuries were treated, but the mental scars ran deeper. As I stood outside the stark white building, I felt lost, adrift in a world that no longer made sense. Deputy Hansen approached, his face a mask of professional concern. "Mr. Walker, we're organizing a search party for your friend. Are you feeling up to joining us?" I nodded, my throat tight. I have to. I owe it to Paul. The next morning, I found myself back at the trailhead where our nightmare had begun. A group of about 20 people milled about. Park rangers, police officers, and local volunteers. Their chatter died down as I approached, and I could feel their eyes on me, curious and slightly wary. Deputy Hansen cleared his throat, addressing the group. "All right, folks. We're looking for Paul Dexter, last seen 5 days ago. We'll split into teams and comb the area. Remember, safety first. Any signs of large predators, you radio in immediately." As the teams formed up, I couldn't help but notice how people seemed to avoid me. I caught snatches of whispered conversations. "That's him, the guy who claims they were attacked by some monster. Heard he was raving when they found him. Probably just an animal attack and he lost it. Poor bastard. Imagine watching your friend get killed like that." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. But I'd make them see the truth. Our team headed into the forest, the familiar scents of pine and damp earth bringing back a flood of memories. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. The others noticed my jumpiness, exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Hours passed as we methodically searched the area. We found our old campsite, now just a tangle of shredded tent fabric and scattered gear. The massive boulder that had nearly crushed us lay nearby, a silent testament to the creature's incredible strength. "Jesus," one of the volunteers muttered, running his hand over the boulder. "How the hell did this get here?" I opened my mouth to explain, but Deputy Hansen cut me off. "Flash flood, maybe. This area's prone to them." I bit back a retort. They weren't ready to hear the truth. Not yet. As the day wore on, my frustration grew. There was no sign of Paul, no trace of the creature. It was as if the forest had swallowed them both whole. That night, back at the makeshift base camp, I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Paul's face contorted in terror as the creature grabbed him. I heard the sickening crunch of bones and the creature's inhuman roar. I bolted upright, gasping for air, my body drenched in cold sweat. In the dim light of the moon filtering through the trees, the shadows seemed to move and shift. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a massive, hunched figure at the edge of the camp. But I blinked, and it was gone. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The next few days fell into a grim routine. We'd head out at dawn, search until dusk, then return to camp empty-handed. With each passing day, hope dwindled. The whispers behind my back grew louder, more frequent. On the 4th day of the search, I overheard a conversation that made my blood boil. "How long are we going to keep this up?" a volunteer grumbled. "There's nothing out here." "Chief says we give it 1 more day," replied a ranger. "After that, we call it." "And the guy who reported it, Walker?" The ranger sighed. "Probably just shocked, you know. Saw his friend get taken by a bear or something and his mind made up the rest." I wanted to scream at them, to make them understand. But what proof did I have? Nothing but my word and a collection of injuries that could have come from anything. That night, as I lay awake in my tent, a sound caught my attention. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, closer this time. Heart pounding, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The camp was silent, everyone else fast asleep. But at the edge of the firelight, I saw them, two gleaming eyes, reflecting the dying embers. They blinked once, and then were gone. I scrambled out of the tent, my voice rising in panic. "Wake up, it's here, the creature's here!" People began to stir, emerging from their tents in confusion. "Walker? What's going on?" Deputy Hansen approached, looking concerned. "I saw it," I gasped, pointing towards the tree line. The eyes, it was watching us. Hansen and a few others did a quick sweep of the perimeter, but found nothing. No tracks, no sign of any large animal. "Probably just a deer," Hansen said, not unkindly. "Try to get some rest, David. We've got a long day tomorrow." But I couldn't rest. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, hunted. The creature was out there, biding its time. And these people, these well-meaning searchers, had no idea of the danger they were in. The final day of the search dawned gray and drizzly. Morale was low as we set out, everyone knowing that this was likely our last attempt. We pushed deeper into the forest than we had before, into areas so thick with vegetation that we had to hack our way through with machetes. It was in one of these dense thickets that I saw it. A scrap of fabric caught on a thorny bush. My heart leapt as I recognized it, a piece of Paul's shirt. "Over here," I called out, my voice cracking with emotion. "I found something." The others converged on my position, excitement building as they examined the fabric. It was the first real clue we'd found. "Good eye, Walker," Hansen said, bagging the evidence. "Let's spread out, see if we can find anything else." For the next hour, we combed the area with renewed vigor. But as the initial excitement wore off, a sense of unease began to creep over me. Something wasn't right. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet, the only sound the soft patter of rain on leaves. Then I smelled it. That same foul odor I'd encountered on the night of the attack. A mixture of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else. Something primordial and terrifying. "We need to leave," I said, my voice tight with fear. "Now." Hansen looked at me, brow furrowed. "What?" "But we just found our first lead." "Trust me," I pleaded, grabbing his arm. "We're in danger. It's close." Before Hansen could respond, a blood-curdling roar shattered the silence. It was a sound I'd hoped never to hear again, a sound that haunted my nightmares. Panic erupted as everyone scrambled to get away. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground with every stride. A scream pierced the air, abruptly cut short. I wanted to look back to help, but terror drove me forward. The rational part of my mind knew we couldn't outrun this thing, but panic overrode all logic. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. I was falling, tumbling down a steep slope. When I finally came to a stop, dazed and winded, I found myself in a small ravine. The sounds of chaos above had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I lay there, hardly daring to breathe, listening intently for any sign of pursuit. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Gradually, I became aware of movement nearby. Someone else had fallen into the ravine with me. "Hello?" I whispered, fear making my voice tremble. "Who's there?" "Walker, that you?" It was Hansen, his voice tight with pain. "I think I broke my leg in the fall." I crawled over to him, wincing at my own injuries. "We need to stay quiet," I breathed. "It might still be up there." Hansen nodded, his face pale. "What the hell was that thing, David? I've never heard anything like it." "Now do you believe me?" I asked, a note of bitterness creeping into my voice. Before he could answer, a shadow fell over us. Looking up, I saw a massive shape silhouetted against the gray sky. The creature peered down into the ravine, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. Hansen and I held our breath, neither daring to move a muscle. For what felt like an eternity, the creature surveyed the ravine. Then, with a snort that sent a cloud of vapor into the cool air, it turned and lumbered away. We waited for what felt like hours before we dared to move. By then, the light was fading and a cold rain had begun to fall. "We need to get out of here," Hansen said through gritted teeth. "Get back to the others." I nodded, helping him to his feet. We made slow progress up the slope, Hansen leaning heavily on me. When we finally reached the top, we found chaos. The search party had regrouped, but they were 2 members short. Fear and confusion were etched on every face. As we approached, a cacophony of questions erupted. What happened? Where are Tom and Lisa? What was that thing? Hansen held up a hand for silence. "We're calling off the search," he announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Whatever's out there, it's not safe. We're leaving now." The trek back to the trailhead was tense, every snapping twig and rustle of leaves making us jump. As we emerged from the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the creature was out there just beyond the tree line waiting. In the days that followed, as the story hit the local news, I was interviewed countless times. I told them everything, about the initial attack, about Paul, about what we'd encountered during the search. But I could see the doubt in their eyes, hear the skepticism in their voices. The official report cited a bear attack, with the deaths during the search attributed to a tragic accident. The fabric we'd found, likely dragged there by scavengers. The roar everyone had heard, a mountain lion perhaps, or the wind playing tricks. But I knew the truth. And so did Hansen, though he never spoke of it publicly. As I stood at my window one night looking out at the distant line of trees, I couldn't help but wonder, how many more would have to die before they believed? How long before the creature struck again? And what would I do when it did? The search was over, but I knew in my heart that this was far from finished. Something was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation, something that hungered. The incessant ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to mock me as I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by newspapers. Each headline screamed accusations, doubt, and thinly veiled contempt. Local man claims monster killed friend. Experts skeptical. Search for missing camper ends in tragedy. Survivor's story raises questions. Park rangers dismiss BigFoot, claims in wake of deadly search operation. I pushed the papers away, my hands shaking. How had it come to this? Just weeks ago, I'd been a respected member of the community, a high school science teacher with a quiet life and a bright future. Now, I was a pariah. My name synonymous with either madness or murder, depending on who you asked. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through my brooding. I let it ring several times before finally answering, my voice rough from disuse. "Hello? David?" It was my sister, Sarah. Her voice was tentative, concern evident in every syllable. "How are you doing? We haven't heard from you in days." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just tired. Mom and Dad are worried sick about you. We all are. Why don't you come over for dinner tonight? Get out of that house for a while." The thought of facing my family, seeing the doubt and worry in their eyes, made my stomach churn. "I don't think that's a good idea right now. David, please, we just want to help. Maybe if you talk to someone." "A shrink, you mean?" I cut her off, anger flaring. "You think I'm crazy too, don't you? That's not what I—" "Save it, Sarah. I know what I saw, what I experienced. I don't need anyone trying to convince me otherwise." I hung up before she could respond, immediately regretting my harshness. But the frustration and isolation of the past weeks had worn me down, leaving me raw and defensive. Seeking a distraction, I moved to my desk, where dozens of sketches were scattered across the surface. Each one depicted the creature in various poses, running, crouching, attacking. I had spent countless hours trying to capture every detail, every terrifying feature of the monster that haunted my dreams. As I picked up a pencil and began yet another sketch, my mind wandered back to the day everything had fallen apart. It was 3 days after we had returned from the ill-fated search operation. I sat in a sterile conference room at the local police station, surrounded by stern-faced officials and so-called experts. Sheriff Tanner, A burly man with a salt and pepper mustache cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, we've asked you here today to go over your statement one more time. We've brought in some specialists to help us understand exactly what happened out there." I nodded, my gaze moving over the assembled group. There was a wildlife biologist from the state university, a psychologist with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes, and a man in a crisp suit who had been introduced as an FBI liaison. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" the sheriff prompted. I took a deep breath and began recounting the events for what felt like the 100th time. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief growing on their faces. When I described the creature, the wildlife biologist, Dr. Erickson, leaned forward. "Mr. Walker," he interrupted, "the animal you're describing, it simply doesn't exist. No known species matches that description." "I know what I saw," I insisted, frustration building. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. Its face, it was almost human-like but twisted. And its strength, it threw boulders like they were pebbles. Dr. Erickson shook his head. "It's much more likely you encountered a bear. In high-stress situations, the mind can play tricks." "It wasn't a bear." I slammed my hand on the table, making everyone jump. "I've seen bears. This was something else entirely." The psychologist, Dr. Merrill, spoke up, her voice soothing. "David, it's not uncommon for trauma to affect our perceptions. Your mind might have created this creature as a way to cope with the loss of your friend." I turned to her, my voice low and intense. "Are you saying I imagined Paul's bones snapping in that thing's grip? That I dreamed up the sound of its roar, or the stench of its breath?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. The FBI agent, who had been quietly observing until now, leaned forward. "Mr. Walker, let's approach this from another angle. You were the last person to see Paul Dexter alive. And now, not only is he missing, but 2 more people lost their lives during the search operation. Can you understand why some might find your story difficult to believe?" The implication in his words hit me like a physical blow. "You think I had something to do with their deaths? That's insane." Sheriff Tanner held up a hand. "No one's accusing you of anything, David. We're just trying to understand what happened." But I could see it in their eyes. The doubt, the suspicion. In that moment, I realized that no matter what I said, they would never believe me. The truth was too fantastic, too terrifying for them to accept. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We're done here. I've told you everything I know. If you won't believe me, that's your problem." As I stormed out of the room, I heard Dr. Merrill call after me, "David, please, we can help you if you'll let us." But I was beyond help, at least beyond the kind of help they were offering. The memory faded, leaving me staring at the sketch I had been absent-mindedly working on. The creature's eyes seemed to glare back at me from the paper, filled with a malevolent intelligence that still chilled me to the bone. A knock at the door startled me from my reverie. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door to find Deputy Hanson standing on my porch, looking uncomfortable. "David," he nodded in greeting. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him enter. Hanson's eyes widened as he took in the state of my living room. Walls covered in sketches of the creature, books on cryptozoology and folklore scattered everywhere. "Jesus, David," he muttered. "What have you been doing to yourself?" I crossed my arms defensively. "Research, trying to figure out what that thing was. Why it's here." Hanson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't come here officially. I wanted to check on you, make sure you're okay." "Okay?" I laughed bitterly. "Half the town thinks I'm insane. The other half thinks I'm a murderer. How could I possibly be okay?" "I know what we saw out there," Hanson said quietly. "That roar? It wasn't like anything I've ever heard before. But David, you've got to let this go. For your own sake." I stared at him incredulously. "Let it go?" "That thing is still out there, Hanson. It killed Paul. It killed those searchers. How many more people have to die before someone takes this seriously?" Hanson's face hardened. And what do you think you can do about it? You're not exactly building credibility here, living like this. He gestured at the chaotic room. His words stung. But I knew he was right. I had become obsessed, withdrawn. But how could I not be, knowing what I knew? I can't just pretend it didn't happen, I said softly. I owe it to Paul, to the others, to find out the truth. Hanson looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. Just be careful, all right? Don't do anything stupid. After he left, I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. Hanson's visit had stirred something in me, a realization that I couldn't continue like this, isolated and consumed by my obsession. I needed to find a way to prove what I had seen, to make them believe. But how? The next few days passed in a blur of research and planning. I pored over local histories, folklore, and newspaper archives, looking for any mention of similar creatures or unexplained disappearances in the area. To my surprise, I found more than I had expected. Scattered throughout the region's history were accounts of giant, ape-like creatures, of hikers and campers who had vanished without a trace. Most had been dismissed as tall tales or the product of overactive imaginations. But now, knowing what I knew, they took on a chilling new significance. As I delved deeper into my research, I began to feel a sense of purpose returning. I wasn't crazy. There was a pattern here, a history that couldn't be ignored. One evening, as I was organizing my notes, a news report on the TV caught my attention. In local news, another hiker has gone missing in the Ozark National Forest. This marks the third disappearance in the area in as many months. Park officials urge caution and remind visitors to always hike with a partner and inform others of their plans. My blood ran cold. It was happening again. The creature was still out there, still hunting. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed Hanson's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary. "David, what is it?" "Did you hear about the missing hiker?" I asked without preamble. Hanson sighed. "Yeah, I heard. David, don't. It's the creature, Hanson. It has to be. We have to do something." "We?" Hanson's voice rose. "David, there is no we here. I'm a deputy. I can't go chasing after some mythical monster based on your theories." "But you saw it," I protested. "You heard it." "I don't know what I saw," Hanson said firmly. "And neither do you. Not for certain. Let the professionals handle this, David. Please." The line went dead, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. The next morning, I woke to find a crowd gathered on my front lawn. As I peered out the window, my heart sank. Signs bobbed above the throng, bearing slogans like "Murderer" and "Justice for Paul." I recognized some of the faces in the crowd. Paul's parents, looking gaunt and angry. Former colleagues from the high school. Neighbors I had once considered friends. Their expressions ranged from outright hostility to pitying concern. A rock crashed through my window, showering me with glass. Outside, the crowd's chanting grew louder. "Killer! Killer! Killer!" I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. How had things gotten so out of control? The sound of sirens cut through the angry voices. Moments later, Sheriff Tanner's voice boomed over a megaphone. "All right, folks, that's enough. This is an unlawful assembly. I need everyone to disperse immediately." As the crowd reluctantly began to break up, I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to find Sheriff Tanner standing there looking grim. "David," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I let him in, acutely aware of the state of my home. Tanner's eyes swept over the room, taking in the wall of sketches, the piles of research. "This isn't good, son," he said, shaking his head. "People are scared, angry. With these new disappearances, they're looking for someone to blame." "And they think it's me," I said bitterly. Tanner nodded. "I know you believe what you're saying about this creature, but David, you've got to see how it looks from the outside. A man with no history of mental illness suddenly claims to have seen a monster? And now more people are going missing?" I felt a surge of anger. So you think I'm either crazy or a killer? Is that it? I think you're a man who went through something traumatic, Tanner said carefully. And I think you need help. Professional help. I'm not crazy, I insisted. And I'm not a murderer. That thing is real, Sheriff. And it's still out there. Tanner sighed, looking suddenly old and tired. David, I'm trying to help you here. But if these disappearances continue, if you keep pushing this monster story, I might not be able to protect you. Do you understand? I understood all too well. In their eyes, I was either a madman or a murderer. There was no room for the truth, no matter how fantastic it might be. After Tanner left, I sat in the wreckage of my living room, feeling more isolated than ever. The broken window let in a cool breeze that stirred the papers scattered across the floor. My gaze fell on one of my sketches of the creature, its eyes seeming to mock me from the page. In that moment, I made a decision. If no one would believe me, if no one would help me, then I would have to take matters into my own hands. I would find proof of the creature's existence, no matter what it took. As I began to plan, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a terrifying question. What if they were right? What if I really was losing my mind? I pushed the thought away. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. The creature was real, and I would prove it, even if it cost me everything. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into preparation. I gathered supplies, camping gear, trail cameras, a high-powered rifle I hoped I wouldn't have to use. I pored over maps of the area where Paul had disappeared, where the recent hikers had gone missing. As I worked, I became aware of a constant presence outside my home. Sometimes it was curious neighbors watching from behind twitching curtains. Other times, it was more overt, a police cruiser parked across the street, its occupants keeping a not-so-subtle eye on my comings and goings. I knew what they thought, that I was either planning to flee or to strike again. Let them think what they wanted. I had a mission now, a purpose that burned away the fog of doubt and despair that had clouded my mind. One evening, as I was loading supplies into my car under the watchful eyes of my neighbors, Sarah showed up unannounced. The look of shock on her face when she saw me told me everything I needed to know about my appearance. "David," she gasped, taking in my unkempt beard and wild eyes. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to find it, Sarah," I said, continuing to load the car. "I'm going to prove that I'm not crazy, that I didn't kill anyone." Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please, David, don't do this. Come home with me. We can get you help, figure this out together." For a moment I wavered. The love and concern in my sister's eyes almost broke through the wall I had built around myself. But then I remembered Paul's face, contorted in terror as the creature grabbed him. I remembered the disbelief in everyone's eyes when I tried to tell them the truth. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said, gently removing her hand from my arm. "But this is something I have to do." As I drove away, I could see Sarah in my rearview mirror, her figure growing smaller as she stood in my driveway, shoulders shaking with sobs. I hardened my heart against the guilt and pain. I couldn't turn back now. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered. And I was the only one who could find it. The forest welcomed me back like an old friend, its familiar scents and sounds both comforting and terrifying. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, away from the well-traveled trails, I felt a sense of grim determination settling over me. I set up camp in a small clearing, taking care to position my trail cameras in a wide perimeter. If the creature was out here, if it came near my camp, I would have proof. Days passed, blending into one another. I split my time between monitoring the cameras and conducting methodical searches of the surrounding area, looking for any sign of the creature's presence. At night, huddled in my tent, I listened to the sounds of the forest with hypervigilant ears. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. But the creature didn't show itself. As the days turned into weeks, doubt began to creep back in. What if I really was chasing shadows? What if the trauma of losing Paul, of nearly dying myself had broken something in my mind. It was on the 17th night that everything changed. I was awoken by a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. It was a sound I had hoped never to hear again, yet had been desperately waiting for. The musty smell of old books filled my nostrils as I hunched over a weathered tome in the back corner of the local library. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows, giving the scene an almost dreamlike quality. But this was no dream. It was my new reality. For months now, I had dedicated every waking moment to unraveling the mystery of the creature that had torn my life apart. The library had become my second home, its shelves holding the promise of answers. If only I knew where to look. "Closing time in 15 minutes, the librarian's voice called out, startling me from my concentration. I blinked, realizing I had lost track of time again. My eyes burned from hours of reading, and my back ached from being hunched over the table. With a sigh, I began gathering my notes, a chaotic mix of scribbled observations, crude maps, and photocopied pages from various books. As I was stuffing papers into my worn backpack, a small news clipping fluttered to the floor. I bent to pick it up, my eyes scanning the faded print. "Hunter claims monster attack in Ozark Forest, 1952. My heart quickened. How had I missed this before? I quickly shoved the clipping into my pocket, planning to examine it more closely once I got home. The cool evening air hit me as I stepped out of the library, a stark contrast to the stuffy interior. The streets were quiet, most of the shops already closed for the night. As I walked, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. This small town had not forgotten the events of last summer, nor had they forgiven me for what many still believed was my role in the deaths. I quickened my pace, eager to return to the relative safety of my apartment. Once inside, I tossed my backpack onto the cluttered desk and fished the news clipping from my pocket. Under the harsh light of my desk lamp, I read, "Local hunter Jeb Hawkins, 43, claims to have been attacked by an unknown creature while hunting in the Ozark National Forest last week. Hawkins, visibly shaken, described the beast as bigger than any bear, with a face almost human-like but twisted. Wildlife officials dismiss Hawkins' account, suggesting he may have encountered a black bear and been confused in the dim light. Hawkins insists his story is true, stating, "I've been hunting these woods for 30 years. I know the difference between a bear and whatever this thing was." My hands trembled as I set the clipping down. This was it, the first piece of solid evidence that the creature I had encountered was not a new phenomenon. Whatever this thing was, it had been in these woods for decades, perhaps longer. Energized by this discovery, I turned to the large map of the Ozarks I had pinned to my wall. Red pins marked the locations of known attacks and sightings, including my own. With shaking hands, I added a new pin for Jeb Hawkins' 1952 encounter. As I stepped back, a pattern began to emerge. The sightings, spread out over decades, seemed to cluster around a specific area of the forest, a region so remote and rugged that it had remained largely unexplored even to this day. "This is it," I whispered to myself, tracing the area with my finger. "This is where it lives." A knock at the door jarred me from my thoughts. Warily, I approached, peering through the peephole. To my surprise, I saw Deputy Hansen standing in the hallway looking uncomfortable. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. "Deputy?" I said, my voice neutral. "What brings you here?" Hansen shifted his weight, not quite meeting my eyes. "David?" He nodded. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Hansen's eyes widened as he took in the state of my apartment, walls covered in maps and newspaper clippings, books stacked haphazardly on every surface. "Jesus, David," he muttered. "You're still on this? It's not just a fixation, Hansen," I said, closing the door. "I'm finding evidence, patterns. This thing has been out there for years, maybe even decades." Hansen sighed, running a hand through his hair. That's actually why I'm here. There's been another disappearance. My heart skipped a beat. Where? About 10 miles north of where the search ended last summer. A couple of hikers. They were supposed to check in with the rangers 3 days ago. Search parties haven't found anything yet. I turned to my map, adding another red pin with trembling hands. It fits the pattern, I said, more to myself than to Hansen. It's getting bolder, coming closer to the populated areas. David, Hansen's voice was gentle but firm. I didn't come here officially, but people are scared. The rumors about you, they're getting worse. Some folks are talking about taking matters into their own hands. I turned to face him, anger bubbling up inside me. So you came to warn me? To tell me to leave town before the mob shows up with torches and pitchforks? Hansen held up his hands placatingly. I came because despite everything, I consider you a friend. And because... He hesitated, lowering his voice. Because I can't shake what I heard that day in the forest. That roar. It wasn't natural, David, but I can't. I can't let myself believe in monsters. I've got a job to do, people to protect. His words hit me like a physical blow. Here was someone who had experienced a fraction of what I had, who had heard the creature with his own ears. And even he couldn't fully believe. Then why are you here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Hansen met my eyes for the first time since entering the apartment. Because if there's even a chance you're right, if there's something out there killing people, we need to stop it. And you're the only one who's been tracking this thing. For a moment I couldn't speak. After months of disbelief and isolation, here was someone offering, if not belief, then at least the benefit of the doubt. Okay, I said finally. What do you want to know? For the next few hours, I walked Hansen through everything I had discovered. The pattern of sightings, the historical accounts, the geographical clustering of incidents. To his credit, he listened without interruption, his face growing more troubled with each passing minute. This is a lot to take in, he said finally, staring at the map covered in red pins. But even if you're right, even if this thing is real, what can we do about it? We're not exactly equipped to hunt monsters. I had been asking myself the same question for months. I don't know, I admitted, but we have to try. More people are going to die if we don't. Hansen nodded slowly. All right. I can't promise anything official, but I'll help where I can. Keep me updated on anything new you find. After Hansen left, I sat at my desk, my mind racing. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't alone in this anymore. With renewed determination, I turned back to my research. There had to be more out there. More sightings, more encounters. I just had to find them. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days. I dug deeper into local histories, pored over old newspapers, and even started reaching out to self-proclaimed cryptozoologists and paranormal investigators. Most of what I found was useless, obvious hoaxes or misidentified bears. But every now and then, I'd stumble upon an account that rang true, that matched what I had experienced in those terrifying moments in the forest. One evening, as I was transcribing notes from an interview with a retired forest ranger, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Hansen. Need to talk. Meet me at Joe's Diner in 30 mins. Come alone. My heart raced as I grabbed my jacket and headed out. Joe's Diner was a greasy spoon on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people minded their own business. Perfect for a clandestine meeting. I arrived to find Hansen already seated in a back booth, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. His face was drawn, his eyes darting nervously around the nearly empty diner. What's going on? I asked as I slid into the seat across from him. Hansen leaned forward, his voice low. I think you were right, David. About all of it. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened? I was part of the search party for those missing hikers, he began, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. We were deep in the woods, in that area you pointed out on your map. It was getting dark and we were about to call it quits for the day when... He trailed off, taking a long sip of coffee. When what? I prompted, my heart pounding. I heard it, Hansen said, his voice barely above a whisper. That same roar from last summer, and then I saw something moving through the trees. It was huge, David, bigger than any animal I've ever seen, and fast, so fast. I felt a mix of vindication and terror wash over me. Did anyone else see it? Hansen shook his head. No, at least no one's saying if they did, but I know what I saw, and I knew I had to tell you. We need to go back out there, I said, my mind already racing with possibilities. Set up cameras, gather evidence. It's not that simple, Hansen sighed. The Forest Service is talking about closing that whole section of the park. Too many disappearances, and even if we could get in... David, this thing is dangerous. You know that better than anyone. I leaned back, frustration bubbling up inside me. So what? We just let it keep killing? Hope it doesn't decide to come closer to town? Hansen was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. We need a plan. A real one. Not just running into the woods hoping to snap a picture. We spent the next hour brainstorming, our half-eaten meals growing cold as we debated strategies and resources. By the time we left the diner, we had the beginnings of a plan. Risky, potentially illegal, but a plan nonetheless. As I drove home that night, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. After months of doubt and isolation, I finally had an ally. Someone who believed me, who had seen the creature with their own eyes. But with that validation came a new wave of fear. The creature was real. It was out there, and we were planning to hunt it. The next few days were a flurry of preparation. Hansen used his position to quietly gather information on the areas of the forest that were still accessible. I reached out to some of the more credible cryptozoologists I had contacted, seeking advice on tracking and capturing evidence of unknown species. We set a date for our expedition, 3 days from now, when Hansen could get time off without raising suspicion. As the day approached, I found myself oscillating between excitement and terror. The night before we were set to leave, I sat at my desk, double-checking our supplies and going over the plan one last time. A movement outside my window caught my eye. Peering out, I saw a figure standing across the street, partially hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree. My blood ran cold as I recognized Paul's father, his eyes fixed on my apartment with a look of pure hatred. I quickly stepped away from the window, my heart pounding. The town's suspicion of me had never fully abated, but this was the first time someone had so blatantly... What? Stalked me? Threatened me? With shaking hands, I picked up my phone to call Hansen, then hesitated. What could he do? It wasn't illegal for someone to stand on a public street no matter how unsettling their presence might be. Instead, I found myself dialing a number I hadn't called in months. David? Sarah's voice was a mixture of surprise and concern. Is everything okay? I don't know, I admitted, suddenly feeling very small and very alone. I think I'm in trouble, Sarah. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. Tell me what's going on, David. All of it. And so I did. I told her everything. About the creature, about my research, about Hansen's sighting, about our plan to go back into the forest, and about Paul's father standing vigil outside my apartment like an avenging angel. Sarah listened without interruption, a fact for which I was intensely grateful. When I finally fell silent, she took a deep breath. Oh, David, she sighed. I wish you had told me all this sooner. I believe you. Her words hit me like a physical blow. After months of doubt and dismissal, to hear those 3 simple words from my sister was almost more than I could bear. You do? I managed to choke out. I do, Sarah affirmed. I know you, David. I know you wouldn't make this up. Wouldn't cling to a delusion for this long. If you say this thing is real, then it's real. Relief washed over me, bringing with it a wave of exhaustion I hadn't realized I'd been holding at bay. "Thank you," I whispered. "But David," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a note of steel, "this plan of yours, it's insane. You're talking about going after a creature that's killed people, that nearly killed you. You can't do this alone." "I'm not alone," I protested weakly. "Hansen's coming with me." "A deputy with no experience in this kind of thing is not enough," Sarah insisted. "You need real help. Professional help." I laughed bitterly. "Who, Sarah? Who's going to believe us? The police? The Forest Service? They all think I'm either crazy or a murderer." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was filled with determination. "Then we'll find someone who will believe. There have to be experts out there, people who investigate this sort of thing. Real experts, not just internet crackpots." "We?" I asked, latching onto that one word. "Yes, we," Sarah confirmed. "I'm not letting you do this alone anymore, David. We're in this together now." For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't alone. I had allies. Hansen with his official access, and now Sarah with her unwavering support and practical mind. "Okay," I said, feeling a glimmer of hope. "What's our next move?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. "First, you need to get out of that apartment. It's not safe for you there, not with Paul's father watching you. Pack a bag and come stay with me for a few days." I glanced out the window, seeing that the figure was still there, still watching. "All right," I agreed. "I'll be there in an hour." "Good," Sarah said. "And David? We're going to figure this out. Together." As I hung up the phone and began to pack, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear of the creature and what lay ahead, certainly, but also a sense of relief and even excitement. For the first time since that terrible night in the forest, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just treading water. Whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. The next morning found me seated at Sarah's kitchen table, bleary-eyed from a restless night, but feeling more centered than I had in months. The smell of coffee filled the air as Sarah bustled about, her laptop open on the counter. "Okay," she said, bringing 2 steaming mugs to the table. "I've been doing some research. There's a cryptozoologist named Dr. Elena Martinez who might be able to help us. She's got real credentials, PhD in biology, published papers on undiscovered species, and she's done field work in areas with reported sightings of unknown creatures." I took a sip of coffee, considering. Sounds promising, but will she believe us? Take us seriously? Sarah smiled, a hint of her old mischief in her eyes. "That's the best part. I reached out to her last night, sent her some of the information you've gathered. She's intrigued, David. Wants to meet with us." I nearly choked on my coffee. "What? When?" "This afternoon," Sarah said. "I told her it was urgent. She's flying in from Colorado." My mind raced. This was happening so fast. After months of dead ends and disappointments, suddenly things were moving at breakneck speed. "What about Hansen?" I asked. "Our plan?" "I texted him this morning," Sarah replied. "Told him there's been a change of plans. He's meeting us at my office this afternoon." I shook my head in amazement. In less than 12 hours, my sister had accomplished more than I had in months of solitary struggle. The cardboard box sat on my kitchen table, a physical representation of the past year of my life. Inside were stacks of maps, newspaper clippings, blurry photographs, and notebooks filled with my increasingly desperate scrawls. I ran my hand over the lid, tracing the words I'd written there in thick black marker. Ozark Incident. With a deep breath, I opened the box one last time. The topmost item was a frayed map of the Ozarks, covered in red X's marking possible Bigfoot sightings. Below that, a stack of printouts detailing local legends and cryptozoology theories. And there, at the bottom, was the sketch pad. I hesitated before pulling it out, knowing what I'd find inside. My hand shook slightly as I opened to the first page. The creature's face stared back at me, its eyes burning with an intelligence that still haunted my dreams. I'd drawn it countless times, trying to capture every detail before they faded from memory. Enough, I muttered, closing the sketchpad with a snap. It's time to let this go. I began methodically sorting through the contents of the box, creating piles for recycling and shredding. As I worked, my mind drifted back over the events of the past year. The first few weeks after the attack had been a blur of police interviews, search parties, and sleepless nights. I'd told my story over and over, first to the local sheriff, then to state police, and finally to a pair of skeptical FBI agents. "Mr. Lawson," one of the agents had said, leaning forward across the interview table, "I need you to understand how this sounds. You're claiming that your friend was killed by what exactly?" I'd taken a deep breath, steeling myself for the disbelief I knew was coming. "It was a Bigfoot. I know how crazy that sounds, but I'm telling you what I saw. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. It moved like nothing I've ever seen before. So fast, so powerful." The agent had exchanged a look with his partner before continuing. "And you're sure it wasn't a bear? The Ozarks have a healthy black bear population. It wasn't a bear," I'd insisted, my voice rising. "I know what I saw. This thing walked on 2 legs. It had a face that was almost human, but not quite. And the sounds it made." I'd shuddered at the memory. "Mr. Lawson," the second agent had cut in, her voice gentler. "You've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes in moments of extreme stress, our minds can play tricks on us. It's possible that—" "No!" I'd slammed my hand on the table, making them both jump. "I'm not crazy and I'm not lying. Paul is dead because of that thing, and you need to do something about it before it kills again." But they hadn't done anything, not really. The official search for Paul had been called off after a week. The prevailing theory was that he'd fallen into a ravine or been attacked by a bear. My story of a Bigfoot attack was dismissed as the ramblings of a man driven temporarily insane by grief and fear. I couldn't accept that. I'd thrown myself into researching everything I could about Bigfoot sightings in the Ozarks. I'd spent countless hours combing through online forums, reaching out to self-proclaimed experts, and even making a few trips back to the area where the attack had happened. But as the months wore on, I'd found nothing. No concrete evidence, no other sightings that matched what I'd seen. Just a growing sense of frustration and an ever-present fear that gnawed at the edges of my mind. A knock at the door jolted me back to the present. I looked up from the pile of papers I'd been shredding, realizing with a start that several hours had passed. "Jake? You in there?" It was my sister, Sarah. I cleared my throat. "Yeah, come in." Sarah entered, her eyes immediately drawn to the mess on the table. "Oh, Jake," she said softly. "What are you doing?" I gestured vaguely at the box. "Just, cleaning up, getting rid of some stuff." She picked up one of the newspaper clippings, her brow furrowing as she read the headline, "Local man claims Bigfoot killed friend, experts skeptical." "Are you sure about this?" she asked, setting the clipping down gently. I nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's time. I can't keep living like this, Sarah. I need to move on." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. "I know it's been hard," she said, "but maybe getting rid of everything isn't the answer. Have you thought about talking to someone? A therapist, maybe?" I laughed humorlessly. "And tell them what? That I'm traumatized from watching my best friend get killed by a mythical creature?" "That's not what I meant," Sarah said, reaching out to touch my arm. "Jake, you went through something terrible. Whether it was exactly what you think you saw or not, the trauma is real. You need help processing it." I pulled away, suddenly feeling defensive. "I'm fine. I just need to put this all behind me." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Have you talked to Paul's family recently?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I shook my head, guilt washing over me. I can't. Every time I see them, I can't face them, Sarah. They don't blame you, Jake. You know that, right? I stood up abruptly, needing to move. They should, I said bitterly. If I hadn't insisted on that stupid camping trip. Stop it, Sarah said firmly. What happened wasn't your fault, and avoiding them isn't helping anyone. I paced the small kitchen, running my hands through my hair. You don't understand. Every time I see them, I'm reminded of what happened, of what I couldn't do to save him. Sarah stood and blocked my path, forcing me to look at her. Jake, listen to me. You need to go to the memorial service tomorrow. I froze. What? Paul's memorial service, Sarah said gently. It's tomorrow afternoon. His parents called me, hoping I could convince you to come. The room seemed to spin around me. I can't, I stammered. Sarah, please, I can't face them. You can, she insisted, and you need to, for Paul and for yourself. I sank back into my chair, overwhelmed. Sarah sat beside me, her hand on my shoulder. I'll go with you, she said. You don't have to do this alone. We sat in silence for a long moment before I finally nodded. Okay, I whispered. Okay, I'll go. The next day dawned bright and clear, a beautiful spring morning that felt at odds with the heaviness in my heart. I stood in front of the mirror, fumbling with my tie. It had been months since I'd worn anything other than jeans and t-shirts. Sarah arrived to pick me up, looking somber in a black dress. You ready? She asked as I climbed into her car. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As we drove to the church, I stared out the window, my mind racing. What would I say to Paul's family? How could I possibly explain what had happened that night? The parking lot was already filling up when we arrived. I recognized faces from our high school days, old friends and acquaintances I hadn't seen in years. They whispered and stared as Sarah and I walked past, no doubt wondering about the madman who claimed their friend had been killed by BigFoot. Inside the church, I froze in the doorway. At the front of the room was a large photo of Paul, his familiar grin beaming out at the assembled mourners. Beside it stood his parents, greeting people as they entered. I can't do this, I muttered, turning to leave. Sarah caught my arm. Yes, you can, she said firmly. Come on. She led me forward, and suddenly I was face to face with Paul's mother, Linda. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, to my utter shock, she pulled me into a tight hug. Oh, Jake, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so glad you came. I stood there stiffly, unsure how to respond. When she pulled back, I saw tears in her eyes. Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry, I stammered. She shook her head. You have nothing to be sorry for, Jake. We know how much Paul meant to you. Paul's father, Robert, stepped forward then, shaking my hand. It's good to see you, son, he said. We've been worried about you. I blinked in confusion. Worried about me? Linda nodded. We know how hard this has been for you. Paul always said you were like a brother to him. Losing him, well, we understand your pain. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I should have done more, I whispered. I should have saved him. Robert put his hand on my shoulder. Jake, listen to me. What happened wasn't your fault. Paul knew the risks of camping in that area. He wouldn't want you to blame yourself. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Sarah gently steered me towards a pew, and we sat down as the service began. As friends and family members shared memories of Paul, I found myself lost in thoughts of our last night together. The laughter around the campfire, the plans we'd made for future adventures. And then, the terror of the attack. When it was time for the eulogy, I was surprised to hear the pastor call my name. Paul's family has asked if Jake Lawson would like to say a few words, he announced. I looked at Sarah in panic, but she just nodded encouragingly. On shaky legs, I made my way to the front of the church. As I turned to face the crowd, I saw a sea of expectant faces staring back at me. Taking a deep breath, I began to speak. Paul Thompson was my best friend. I said, my voice trembling slightly. We grew up together, shared everything. He was the bravest, kindest person I've ever known. I paused, gathering my thoughts. That last night, in the woods, Paul was so excited about our trip. He loved nature, loved exploring. Even when things got scary, he never lost his sense of adventure. I swallowed hard, fighting back tears. I wish things had ended differently. I wish I could have saved him. But I want you all to know that Paul died doing what he loved, surrounded by the wilderness he cherished so much. Looking directly at Paul's parents, I continued. I know there's been a lot of confusion about what happened that night. I've struggled to make sense of it myself. But the one thing I'm certain of is that Paul was a hero. He faced the unknown with courage, right up until the end. My voice broke on the last word, and I had to pause to compose myself. I miss him every day, I said softly, and I know I always will. But I'm grateful for the time we had together, for all the adventures we shared. Paul made the world a brighter place, and his memory will live on in all of us who loved him. As I stepped down from the podium, there was a moment of silence before the church erupted in applause. I made my way back to my seat in a daze, barely aware of the pats on the back and murmured words of support from those around me. The rest of the service passed in a blur. As people began to file out afterwards, I found myself surrounded by old friends, all expressing their condolences and sharing memories of Paul. It was overwhelming, but also strangely comforting. Eventually, the crowd thinned, and I found myself alone with Paul's parents once again. Thank you for what you said, Jake, Linda said, squeezing my hand. It meant so much to us. Robert nodded in agreement. Paul would have been proud of you, he said. And Jake, we want you to know that we don't hold anything against you. Whatever happened out there, we know you did everything you could. I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying lift from my shoulders. Thank you, I said softly. That means more than you know. As Sarah and I left the church, I felt different. The grief was still there, the trauma still raw. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking more clearly than I had in a long time. The obsession that had driven me for months began to loosen its grip. I still believed what I'd seen that night in the woods, but I realized that my quest for proof had become a way of avoiding dealing with my grief and trauma. A week after the memorial service, I made a decision. I called the therapist Sarah had recommended and made an appointment. It wasn't easy, opening up about everything that had happened, but slowly, session by session, I began to process my experiences. Dr. Reeves, my therapist, never outright dismissed my account of what had happened. Instead, she focused on helping me work through the trauma and grief, regardless of the specific details of the attack. Jake, she said during one particularly difficult session, whether or not what you saw was exactly as you remember it, the fear and loss you experienced were very real. We need to address those feelings. I nodded, twisting a tissue in my hands. I can't shake the feeling that I failed Paul, that I should have done more to save him. Dr. Reeves leaned forward. Let's talk about that. What do you think you could have done differently? I closed my eyes, remembering the terrifying moments of the attack. I should have fought harder, I said. I should have found a way to distract the creature, to give Paul a chance to escape. And what do you think would have happened if you had done that? Dr. Reeves asked gently. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I probably would have died too, I admitted. Dr. Reeves nodded. Survival instinct is a powerful thing, Jake. In moments of extreme danger, our bodies and minds react in ways we can't always control or predict. The fact that you survived doesn't mean you failed Paul. It means you have a chance to honor his memory by living your life. It was a breakthrough moment for me. Over the following weeks and months, I continued to work with Dr. Reeves, slowly coming to terms with what had happened and learning to manage the anxiety and PTSD symptoms that had plagued me since the attack. As summer turned to fall, I made another big decision. I'd been on leave from my job as a software engineer since the incident, but I knew I couldn't put off returning to work forever. The problem was, I couldn't face going back to my old office, with all its memories and the pitying looks from coworkers who'd heard about my breakdown. So I started looking for new opportunities. To my surprise, I found myself drawn to positions that would take me far from the familiar landscapes of the Midwest. After several interviews, I accepted a job offer from a tech startup in Seattle. The day I told Sarah about my plans to move, I could see the mixture of worry and relief in her eyes. "Seattle?" she asked. "That's so far away, Jake. Are you sure about this?" I nodded, feeling more certain than I had about anything in a long time. "I need a fresh start, Sarah. Somewhere without all these memories. Somewhere I can just be me again." She pulled me into a hug. "I'm going to miss you so much," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "But I'm proud of you, Jake. You've come so far." As I packed up my apartment in the following weeks, I came across the box of BigFoot research materials I'd set aside months ago. I stood there for a long moment staring at it, before finally picking it up and carrying it to the dumpster outside. But as I lifted the lid, I hesitated. With a sigh, I set the box back down and opened it one last time. I pulled out the sketch pad with my drawings of the creature, flipping through the pages slowly. I still believed what I'd seen that night. The memory of the attack was etched into my mind forever. But I realized now that constantly reliving it, constantly searching for proof, wasn't helping anyone, least of all me. I tore out the most detailed sketch I'd done, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my wallet. The rest of the box's contents I dumped into the dumpster. It was time to let go. The night before I left for Seattle, Sarah insisted on throwing me a small going-away party. Just a few close friends and family members gathered at her house for dinner and drinks. As I looked around at the familiar faces, I felt a bittersweet ache in my chest. The gentle patter of rain against the bedroom window did little to soothe Sarah's frayed nerves. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as shadows danced across its surface. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 3:17 a.m., a cruel reminder of another sleepless night. It had been 5 years since that fateful camping trip in the Ozarks, but the memories remained as fresh as an open wound. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to ward off the flood of images that threatened to overwhelm her. But it was no use. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw it all again. The dense forest, the eerie silence, the blood-curdling howl that shattered the night. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up, running a trembling hand through her sweat-damp hair. "Get it together," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "It's over. You're safe now." But even as the words left her lips, Sarah knew they were a lie. She never felt safe anymore, not really. The fear had become a constant companion, a shadow that followed her everywhere she went. With a resigned sigh, Sarah swung her legs over the side of the bed and padded to the kitchen. The hardwood floor creaked beneath her feet, each sound making her flinch. In the kitchen, she flicked on the light, squinting against its harsh glare. As she filled a glass with water from the tap, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. Dark circles ringed her eyes, a testament to countless nights of broken sleep. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "What happened to you?" she murmured, tracing the lines of exhaustion etched into her face. The sound of a branch scraping against the side of the house made Sarah jump, water sloshing over the rim of her glass. She set it down with a shaky hand, her gaze darting to the window. The backyard was shrouded in darkness, the trees beyond the fence swaying in the wind. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something move in the shadows. A tall, dark figure just beyond the reach of the porch light. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. "No," she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. "It's not real. It can't be real." When she opened her eyes again, the yard was empty. Just trees and shadows, nothing more. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the sink. "Get a grip, Sarah," she chastised herself. "You can't keep living like this." But even as she said the words, Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. The fear had taken root deep inside her, its tendrils wrapping around her heart and squeezing tight. It was always there, waiting for moments of weakness to resurface. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for her phone on the counter. She hesitated for a moment before unlocking it and scrolling through her contacts. Her finger hovered over a name she hadn't called in months, Dr. Elizabeth Chen. Sarah had stopped seeing her therapist shortly after moving to this new town, convinced she could handle things on her own. Now, in the oppressive silence of her kitchen at 3:30 in the morning, she wasn't so sure. Before she could talk herself out of it, Sarah pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Dr. Elizabeth Chen. I'm not available right now, but please leave a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." The beep sounded, and Sarah found herself at a loss for words. What could she say? That she was still haunted by something she couldn't explain? That she jumped at every shadow and flinched at every unexpected sound? "Dr. Chen, it's Sarah. Sarah Lawson," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's been a while, but I think I need help. The nightmares are getting worse, and I can't shake this feeling that something's wrong, that it's not over." She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry for calling so late. I didn't know who else to turn to. Please call me back when you can." "Thank you." Sarah ended the call, feeling both relieved and foolish. What difference would talking about it make? It wouldn't change what had happened, wouldn't erase the terror that still gripped her heart. As she made her way back to the bedroom, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She paused at the foot of the stairs, her gaze drawn to the front door. The deadbolt was engaged, the chain lock in place. She checked them 3 times before going to bed, as she did every night. Still, Sarah found herself walking to the door, her hand reaching out to test the locks once more. The cool metal of the doorknob was reassuring beneath her fingers. Everything was secure. She was safe. But as Sarah turned to head back upstairs, a sound froze her in place. It was faint, barely audible over the patter of rain, but unmistakable. A low guttural growl, coming from just outside the door. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step back, then another, her eyes fixed on the door. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping against the porch. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head in denial. No. This isn't happening. It can't be happening." But even as she tried to convince herself it wasn't real, Sarah knew deep down that this was no figment of her imagination. The creature from the Ozarks, the thing that had haunted her nightmares for years, was here. It had found her. Sarah turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood as she bolted up the stairs. She slammed her bedroom door shut behind her, fumbling with the lock with shaking hands. Once it was secured, she backed away, her eyes darting around the room in search of a weapon, an escape route, anything. The growl came again, louder now, seeming to reverberate through the entire house. Sarah clapped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut as she sank to the floor. "Wake up," she pleaded with herself. "Please, God, let me wake up." But this was no nightmare. As the sound of splintering wood echoed from downstairs, Sarah knew with terrifying certainty that her worst fears had come true. The creature had found her, and this time, there was nowhere left to run.